Stuart Hall famously summed up the painful predicament of international migration as the dawning realization that no one can ever return home. Overseas migration sets in motion a process of dislocation, along with the encounter with new social environments and landscapes. Over time, these change migrants' consciousness, their intimate knowledge, and taken for granted expectations, while in their absence, the countries and friends they left behind change too, often to the extent that on their return, they find they are no longer in the same country. Describing himself as a cosmopolitan by default, Hall reflects on this sense of loss, noting that every diaspora has its regrets. And he says, although you can never go back to the past, you do have a sense of loss. There is something you have lost, a kind of intimate connection with landscape and family and tradition, which you lose. I think this is the fate of modern people. We have to lose them, but we believe we are going to go back to them. The sense of lost intimacy, the knowing of a place and all its taken for granted ways of thinking, interacting, and systems of relevancy was first theorized by Alfred Schutz in The Homecomer, in a foundational article on the sociology of everyday life. Home means one thing to the man who never has left it, and another thing to the man who dwells far from it, and still another to him who returns. To feel at home is an expression of the highest degree of familiarity and intimacy. There's no need to define or redefine situations which have occurred so many times, or to look for new solutions of old problems hitherto handled satisfactorily. Migration initiates a process in which such intimacies are shattered. The community of space, as he calls it, of vivid, ongoing face-to-face relationships is lost and cannot be regained since, as Schutz recognizes, time is irreversible. The homecomer is not the same man who left. He's neither the same for himself nor for those who await his return. Hall recognizes this predicament. So in my history, this is Stuart Hall, as it happens, my generation stayed at home and got deeply involved in writing the history of the nation. And I wasn't there. I was watching it from afar. So I wasn't enclosed in that. So I see now the limits of that national project. And when I came to England, I couldn't be a member of this one either, that is of England, because I was already deracinated from it. You know, although I'd chosen to live here and marry into it and so on, I'm not a part of the conception of the nation. So I'm a cosmopolitan by default. I have to find my way, like many of us, among many attachments, many identifications, none of them old. I have to recognize how limited that is. And I've tried to maintain what I call the openness of the horizon to that which I am not, the experiences I have not had. Migration creates a sense of double consciousness, an awareness, as W.E. DuBois argues, or DuBois, is it?
DuBois.
Thank you. DuBois argues, we have some Americans or Canadians, in relation to American blacks, of seeing oneself through the eyes of another, a doubling up of a subject sense of belonging and alienation. Migrants and returned migrants share a sense of being split. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled striving. So too, migration and diaspora engender a split subject, a fractured reality. And this is from Paul Gilroy. A homecomer must manage the insider and outsider perspectives simultaneously, seeing herself through and the often disapproving eyes of those who stayed at home. Paradoxically, however, the experience of strangerhood has its own attraction. In Schutz's words, to a certain extent, each homecomer has tasted the magic fruit of strangeness, be it sweet or bitter. Even amid the overwhelming longing for home, there remains the wish to transplant into the old pattern something of the novel goals, of the newly discovered means to realize them, of the skills and experiences acquired abroad. The reversal of time, the disruption of intimate knowledge, the experience of double consciousness, and the growing sense of regret and loss challenge simplistic theorizations of transnationalism as an uninterrupted social field, or of trans-migrants as mobile subjects unproblematically participating in more than one nation-state. However frequent the communication and travel between a migrant country and country of migration, over time a gap between the two gradually widens and cannot be easily sutured. Seen in the longue durée, history and memory are made elsewhere, whether at home or in the diaspora. The unproblematic assumption in transnational theory of uninterrupted, continuing, intimate, taken for granted sociality across homeland and diaspora misrecognizes the critical phenomenological question of how intimate knowledge is sustained over discontinuous space and time. This implies that the sense of simultaneity experienced by migrants in their transnational social relations, this is the word is used by Levitt and Glick-Schiller in an article in 2004, of sharing space in a continuous social field reflects only a partial truth, hiding from participants themselves. I think this is where the point I make. Ruptures that can only become apparent when and if migrants return home on holidays or especially to live. Nevertheless, the illusion of simultaneity remains a powerful experiential force, especially within transnational families, defining migrants' sense of self and subjectivity, and more so in the age of easy Skype and mobile phone connectivity, an issue I return to below. As summarized by Glick-Schiller, transnationalism emerged as something of a parochial American argument. It denied an alleged prevailing American melting pot ideology that assumed that immigrants arriving in the New World would cut their ties with their homeland and assimilate to become true Americans. This rupturing of relationships was itself an illusion. However, as Fona, for example, argued, for early European migrations to the United States, although World War II cut off many immigrants off from the European families and hometowns. Sorry, I think the sentence needs to be differently inflected. So Fona argued that although there had been continuous relationships before World War II cut off those relationships for a considerable amount of time. In any case, ethnicity in America has remained a potent force, as Glaser and Moynihan argued, in another kind of critique of assimilationist theory. Equally open to debate was the alleged methodological nationalism of migration studies, the conflation of society and the state. This was the view that privileged state borders and minimize significant cross-border migrant relationship, both personal and political. Minimize. Rather than separate nation states, what needed to be recognized was a continuous social field. Here the transnationalists drew on both Bourdieu's and the Manchester School of Anthropology's theorizing of the social field as encompassing migrant sites of departure and destination. And this is, again, referring back to Levitt and Glick-Schiller. Immigrants were rarely trans-migrants, living in between, all the more so as new contemporary modes of communication across borders enable them to straddle different countries, keeping in touch with those left behind as never before. A final term added to the conceptual armory of the transnationalists has been long-distance nationalism, grasped as a benign emancipatory sense that subverts the original notion of long-distance nationalism without responsibility, as used, for example, by Benedict Anderson. So you can look at long-distance nationalism as a very irresponsible kind of relationship in which support all kinds of negative national causes in the home country, or you can look at it for something positive. Anderson refers to diaspora groups' considerable financial support for religious and nationalist extremists in their countries of origin. Now, the present essay considers some of these issues as they have been tackled in contemporary innovative research on international migration and return migration. I leave aside the obvious truth that well before the invention of transnational theory to describe international migration, diaspora theory was built around the continuing sentimental, practical, and political loyalties of ethnic groups to countries and places beyond the nation state. So too, the opening up of nation states to trade and imperialism was an early feature of capitalist expansion recognized by Marx and Weber. In the developing world, well before Bush and Schiller and so on wrote their manifesto, scholars in Africa and elsewhere were debating the implication of circulatory labor migration, which has indeed remained a typical pattern in many parts of the world. So labor migrants within Africa move back and forth to work in mining towns and so on. Now, without going into the widely debated question then of what's new in transnational approaches, I argue here for the need to probe the complex emotional and moral dimensions of transnational migration that lead to ruptures and create new configurations and clustering in the transnational migration field. So if you think of it historically, there was a kind of idea that there was a movement without return, especially to the United States. And that was kind of denied by various studies in the US itself. But currently, the idea is of a sort of optimistic idea of an open, homogeneous transnational field without any ruptures. And this has moral and emotional implications, and this is what I'm trying to argue against. A distinctive recent challenge to simplistic, optimistic notions of transnational migration has come from Hassan Haj, whose study of a Lebanese extended family living across 4 continents led him to formulate the notion of migration guilt, loss and rupture. Others, like Daniel Miller and Mirka Madiano, and you've heard Miller the other day, have probed the limits of new communication media in creating intimacy and co-presence among Filipino mothers and children. It's really a fantastic study that they did of how Filipino mothers tried to keep in touch and supervise the caring for their children, and very unsuccessfully most of the time. A third central strand in contemporary transnational migration theory has looked at the plight of undocumented migrants who are blocked from travelling back and forth to their homelands. Thus, Ali Noble Ahmed argues perceptively against the early depiction of immigrants to Britain as fostering a myth of a return home, that for the contemporary wave of undocumented Pakistani migrants to Europe, there's instead a myth of arrival. They never get there. They're constantly trying to arrive in Europe, to settle. Another innovative strand in the transnational migration scholarship is that of second-generation return migrations, which probes the painful dilemmas and paradoxes encountered by returnees that signal ruptures rather than continuities in the transnational field. Beyond these, and somewhat in answer to both Haj's pessimism and over-optimistic theories of transnationalism, are theories of international migration and diaspora that recognize the mediation of multiple intersecting, newly formed moral communities or circles of trust in the migration context. And this being most of my own work. In other words, the idea that it isn't just the guilt, or the myth of return. It's the fact that people, when they settle in a new place, create circles of trust, new friendships, new relationships. And migrants, so that migrants situationally manage multiple valorized identities, even in destination places where their stay is restricted by legal contracts, as in the case, for example, of Filipino migrants to Israel. In this latter respect, too, the dismissal of the nation-state by transnational theorists as an instance of methodological nationalism is ironically denied by migrants themselves. A good deal of recent scholarly research on international migration shows how migrants map the world in terms of the rights, entitlements, and visa regulations allowed to newcomers and workers by various countries. Thus, research on Pakistanis, Black Africans, or Filipino female migrants show how the rules of regulating work permits and residency in different nation-states are highly significant to them. So you can't argue that the nation-state is irrelevant. Intercontinental marriages and mail-order brides are a familiar strategy linked to such understandings of legal differentials between states. The moral economy of migration and citizenship is built around such mappings, identities and socialities formed away from home, and rests on moral assumptions about the entitlements conferred by hard work, however menial. So, despite invocations of simultaneity within the transnational social field, the ethnographies of Glick, Schiller and Ferron, for example, and of Peggy Levitt, are both remarkable for repeatedly highlighting not continuities, but painful ruptures separating migrants within their new places of settlement and from their home communities. So what I'm saying here is if you look at the actual ethnographies of Levitt and Glick, Schiller, rather than just listening to their theoretical programs, then you find the very opposite of what they argue. So Levitt studied in the Dominican Republic and in Boston, and Glick, Schiller studied in New York, I think, and in
Haiti.
Haiti, right. Haiti. And so they both wrote monographs. So what their research highlights is not continuities, but painful ruptures separating migrants from their new places of settlement and from their home communities, often despite their valiant efforts to support the folk back home, or alternatively to sink roots in the place of migration. Hence, the message of Levitt's study of Dominican migrants living in Boston, is highly pessimistic. Life in Boston is extremely hard for migrants. They live scattered and meet only intermittently, since they often hold more than one full-time menial job. Their community institutions are rudimentary, although they do fundraise for the home country. They often leave children in the homeland behind to be cared for by relatives. In the absence of parental discipline, however, children growing up on the island often lack discipline, are showered by parents with spending money as compensation for their absence, and end up with little education, relying on the expectations of future migration, and latterly on the growing drug trade to make up for their lack of qualifications. Children growing up in Boston fare little better, coming back to empty homes since parents work long hours and failing educationally. The emotional bitterness and trauma suffered by families as a result of transnational migrations are thus a key finding of the study. A further finding is that the sending town in the Dominican Republic, which is a fictitious name actually, so I don't know which one it is, I tried to look it up, gradually loses its best people to migration, leaving it underdeveloped and economically backward. Retiring migrants who return to the island rarely manage to convert their hard-earned savings into productive investments, and often end up as impoverished as when they set out on their travels. Levitt introduces the notion of social remittances, which he defines as the ideas, behaviours and social capital that flow from receiving to sending communities, tools which ordinary individuals create global culture at the local level. On the whole, however, I would argue, her examples are less than persuasive that international migration from below, that is, the migration of educated manual workers, really creates meaningful, radical lifestyle shifts in the home country. Given the global flow of ideas via the media, especially television and the internet, the growth of tourism, foreign investment, and in particular the influence of Dominican elite mobility, including transnational movement for higher education, and the impact of international NGOs, it seems that lasting processes of westernization and modernization in the Dominican Republic are in fact the result primarily of globalization and cosmopolitization from above. And what I argue, these working class migrants who go to Boston and come home, barely scratch the surface of what globalization means. They come back, they invest in a little shop, it doesn't work out, they lose all their money over time. It's a disaster. The whole story of their migration is a disaster. If the Dominican Republic is developing in terms of sophisticated new ideas and methods, it's coming from the elites, from people who go to America, to the United States to get an education, from investments at a much larger scale, from the kind of influence that the media has had on the island. Indeed, Levitt found that the town she studied remained stagnant, with returning migrants soon returned to their old ways. The book leaves us with an impression of a dependency economy being sucked into the international drug trade, with most trans-migrants leading hard and joyless lives and being envied by those left behind on the island. So that's Levitt. Glickschiller and Furon's study is equally remarkable for the ruptures it describes as disrupting transnational relationships. They remark, the authors remark, that when trans-migrants return to Haiti, they expect to step into their old roles. And this is a quotation, just as one anticipates going home and finally putting on an old and comfortable clothes. But when they return, and this is still the part of the quotation, they and those who had stayed behind discover that a process of change has been occurring. Home is not what they remember it to be. It is as if the old clothes no longer fit. So this is Glickschiller herself, in her own monograph, contradicting this kind of optimistic view of the transnational social field and simultaneity. Instead of gratitude for remittances and gifts sent, they find, in their words, a crop of bitterness sown and reaped. I don't know what one is to make of this kind of theorizing and writing where your ethnography is completely divorced from your theory. And you can ask yourself that question afterwards. And what do you make of it? And I don't know, nobody bothers to read the ethnography, so. Okay, this points to a familiar theoretical question in diaspora and migration studies of the meaning and the place of home. If the yearning for home is seen as a defining feature of some diasporas, the Jews, the Greeks, the Armenians, theorists of diaspora have challenged the centrality of a lost homeland. There's something here, but I see it's tea or something, is that right?
Tea? Yeah, it's tea.
Thank you. Could I just have water? I missed the tea when it was hot. Could you open this?
There is actually a second, there is a second
glass here.
Yeah.
No, I've got a glass.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got lots of glasses. Right. Theorists of diaspora have challenged the centrality of a lost homeland for the definition of diaspora, and it includes not only Hall and Gilroy, but Boyarin and Boyarin. So too, whereas modern transnational migrants visit home frequently, endangered Indian migrants in the Caribbean, Amitav Ghosh has suggested, saw India as remote, mythologized place of the imagination. The question is, as Aftar Brar famously puts it, and I think she really was one of the early theorizers of home. When does a location become home? What is the difference between feeling at home and staking claim to a place as one's own? It is quite possible to feel at home in a place, and yet the experience of social exclusion may inhibit public proclamations of the place as home. And I think she's thinking in a way about herself as an Indian in the UK. Clearly, or even in East Africa. Clearly, the relationship of the first generation to the place of migration is different from that of subsequent generations, mediated as it is by memories of what was recently left behind, and by the experiences of disruptions and displacement as one tries to reorientate, to form new social networks, and learns to negotiate new economic, cultural, and political realities. While agreeing that one can move between multiple homes, the question is whether, as Rapport and Dawson suggest, as home becomes more mobile, so it comes to be seen as individuated and privatized. Is that a possibility? Second, once uprooted, can modern persons ever find a place that is truly home? So very, very skeptical of home as a notion for modern individuals who roam around. For overseas migrants, it seems, home is neither entirely individualized nor forever absent. It's said it is always embedded in significant social relations and responds to migrants' moral engagement over the life course. I'm kind of disagreeing with the reports, although I understand where they're coming from. I think that you do build up homes over time. They think that nobody ever builds up homes because one is always moving around endlessly. And so home stops being home very quickly and just becomes wherever you are is home. The difference between generations when it comes to home, ancestral home, and homeland is particularly salient in discussions of counter-diasporic movements of second and third generation migrants returning to a homeland they know only through parental memories and occasional visits. And this, King and Christo have written a lot on this. Returnees' double consciousness impacts upon them with the shocking revelation that rather than returning home, they are regarded in their homeland as foreigners and aliens, a feature repeatedly documented in the literature on counter-diasporic second-generation return migrations. And this is to the Caribbean, to Greece and Cyprus. For example, in his masterly study of Japanese-Brazilian return migrants to Japan, for example, Takeyuki Tsuda describes how from being a relatively high-status ethnic group in Japan, Japanese-Brazilian workers in Japan, they went to Japan, found themselves denigrated and shunned by local Japanese, a rejection that engendered a growing realization of themselves as Brazilian in their modes of interaction, sociality and conviviality, in their egalitarian vision, and in their human capacity to have fun and celebrate. The Japanese really didn't think much of them at all. You know. Okay, so Pakistani myths of return and arrival. From the start of their migration, how am I doing for time? I've got about 10 minutes on. From the start of their migration to Britain, Pakistani migrants fostered a myth of return to their homeland. Bolognani argues that whereas for the first generation of migrants, return has gradually been recognized as impossible in practical terms, second generation Pakistanis born and bred in Bradford see return to Pakistan as a way of escaping stigmatization and limited career prospects in post-9/11 Britain. Where migrants have been legally compelled to return home to Pakistan, as in the case of migrants working in the Gulf, they typically suffer from what has been dubbed the DuBois syndrome. In Ballard's original formulation, this refers to the jealousy their newly acquired wealth generates not only among kin, but among Pakistan's urban elite as well, who see the newly rich migrants' behavior as misguided and disturbed. So, in Bolognani's usage, the term refers to the mental distress experienced by returnees. So there's this notion of Dubai syndrome, which different people have understood differently. Given this discourse of return, as the early generation of British Pakistani post-war migrants reached retirement age, one might have expected an exodus of pensioners back to Britain, back to Pakistan. But early Pakistani returnees came back to Britain reporting that, accustomed to the British way of doing things, it was impossible for them to deal with Pakistani red tape and corruption. Often they lost all their savings. They had bad experiences on return. Hence, although there's little data beyond anecdotal evidence, it would seem that most retired Pakistanis have chosen a pragmatic middle path. The majority had already built houses in their natal villages, or quite often in the cities neighbouring their village, and their state pensions enable them to spend part of the year, several months at a time, at home in Pakistan before returning home to Britain, where children and grandchildren live. Pakistani children were in the past expected to go on prolonged visits to Pakistan in order to get to know the folks back home and experience the ambience of rural life nostalgically remembered by their parents. The transnational family in Pakistanis is sustained by frequent visiting back and forth and massive numbers of intercontinental marriages between Britain and Pakistan, with brides and grooms joining second-generation spouses, usually first cousins living in the UK. Charles Lee, however, has documented some of the hardships experienced by these mangeteers, as they call my son, incoming bridegrooms from Pakistan living in with their English wives. Indeed, there's a growing literature on the problems associated with such intercontinental marriage. The recent book is all about divorce and the growing frequency of divorce. In a twist to the aspirational myth of return of post-war Pakistani immigrants, as I mentioned already, Ali Ahmad's study of irregular migrants in Britain and Italy highlights the impossibility of arrival. Irregular Pakistani migrants lived precarious lives, paying large sums of money in Italy in an attempt to regularize their stay, working long hours for little pay, mostly unable to buy a house or bring over their families. Rather than dreaming of going home to Pakistan, they aspire to find a country that will provide them with secure jobs, education, and housing. In a trenchant critique of transnational theory, Ahmed argues that its underlying optimistic narrative is misplaced. The social and financial capital accumulated by networking from below depends on the capitalist context of migration. This is very common in America, this optimistic narrative. Fordist Britain opened up well-paid job opportunities for South Asian migrants in the 1960s and 70s, who also benefited from cheap housing and growing demand for ethnic foods. In contemporary Britain, draconian immigration restrictions and in Italy, high unemployment and housing costs create endemic precarity. Ethnic networks fail to afford support while regular migrants move between European countries and within Italy in their search for employment. And I think your work, Nick, has also highlighted this precarity. But you can tell us more later. Ahmad's monograph draws on Bataille's psychoanalytic notion of eroticism as extreme risk-taking to critique the prevailing assumption that transnational migration is a rational process determined by the family. Young Pakistani migrants in the UK and Europe, both in the early and present generation, embarked, he says, on international migration to escape patriarchal control and to see the wonders of another world glimpsed on the media or encounters with young tourists. Aishi, hedonistic pleasure, and fulfill guma, the desire to roam. So he says, migrants often decide to migrate against the explicit wishes of parents or, if they were married, of their wives. They wheedle out money from reluctant fathers in order to embark on a high-risk journey across the Middle East and Eastern Europe, managed by unscrupulous agents, often living without food or adequate water for weeks. Transported in suffocatingly crowded vehicles and crossing dangerous rivers or the Mediterranean, some never arrive, others are sent back home to Pakistan. Ahmed interprets this experience of extreme danger, falling Bata, as a form of eroticism, but the end result is a poisoned chalice, he says. Migrants' youthful masculine dreams of mastery end for many in deep melancholia as they eke out a meagre living in long hours of work without leisure, unable to marry or bring wives over, in many cases equally unable to go back and even for visit. This bleak vision of transnationalism and migration makes the point that whereas migrants cross many international borders and strike up a wide range of acquaintances across many ethnic and national groups, they remain deeply isolated and alienated in the place of migration. The transnational social field for them is ruptured at both ends, unable to repay the debts incurred for their journey, scattered in Italy but set apart by their lack of resources from fully joining the life in the thriving British Pakistani community in the UK. I'll just speak for another 2 minutes also. Okay. Not all irregular migrants experience this type of isolation, however. Indeed, most remarkable has been the struggle by undocumented migrants in the UK, the USA, and Europe to demand the right to stay. The moral economy of migration rests on a sense of entitlement and national or civic membership migrants develop in their societies of settlement, even in the absence of formal papers. And in his analysis of Ghanaian Akan Methodists in London, Matteo Fumanti proposes reviving the Aristotelian notion of virtuous citizenship, defining the transnational social field more specifically in terms of distinctive flows rooted in the historical relationship of Britain to its former colonies. With or without legal status in Britain, Ghanaian Akan Methodists regard being law-abiding, hard-working taxpayers who contribute to their communities and church congregations, both in Britain and Africa, as the hallmarks of a good citizen. So they sort of ignore the legal status they have and claim to be good citizens because they work hard, they pay taxes. As British Ghanaian Methodists see it, they are virtuous citizens because they ensure the welfare of fellow diasporans in Britain and family and community back home. Church and community thus mediate notions of belonging and citizenship, and this is especially so for African Methodists, for whom the transnational church itself epitomizes British mores and values and mores. Elsewhere in Israel, Galia Saba and Claudia Liebelt find that Black African and Filipino migrants and carers make religious and moral claims to remain in the Holy Land, the center of Christianity, as virtuous Christians, while more recent African refugees in Israel from East Africa, the majority Muslims, claim citizenship by invoking broader human rights discourses. Nevertheless, the absence of legal travel documents and the precarity of their work and earning severely restrict transnational migrants' ability to travel home frequently. We need to remind ourselves that transnational theory emerged among American migration scholars in response to new migration to the USA from the Caribbean, Cuba, Mexico, and Latin America, all virtually on America's doorstep. Cassinitz reports, for example, that Brooklyn's proximity to Trinidad has meant that Trinidadian carnival artists regularly travel back and forth to New York to contribute and participate in the New York Carnival. For migrants elsewhere in the world, however, travel costs can be prohibitive, especially because going home involves an additional huge expenditure on gifts for a wide range of relatives. So people really decide not to go home because they can't afford all the gifts. It's very expensive. In such cases, old and new media become the main form of transnational communication. The question is then, can these substitute for the intimacy of face-to-face relation? Now, I will not talk about Danny Miller's study, which I have a whole thing on here, because I believe he must have talked about it himself. And it's a very good study. Okay, so maybe I'll just make the final comment about it. So these migrant mothers, they show, can talk and see their children in real time, but still the gap, the rupture, persists from the children's point of view. This implies a sociological insight not fully theorized by the authors, related to human experience of sociality as ontologically felt. Authentic, real, genuine social intimacy is embodied and holistic. So the lack of an embodied relationship seems to be incredibly important. In this case, for children in particular, their daily emotional lives, the small events and interactions that make up their waking hours, the physical closeness, the touch, the hug, the daily nurture, are what count in their expectations from their mothers. So their mothers are not fulfilling these expectations. The fact that they can talk to them or see them is totally inadequate. When this embodied support is provided by carers, whether aunts, grandmothers, or fathers, it diminishes the ideal maternal role for them. This is so for young children, while teenagers, often secretive, find it even harder at times to communicate from a distance. Life, however trivial, goes on elsewhere. By the time mothers arrive home, their children have grown up, being cared for by others. It is this ontological rupture, the unreality of even the most sophisticated media, that explains why Filipino migrant women, as most single migrants, call for their families to join them once their status is regularized. In the UK, the newly emerging Filipino community of the 21st century is strikingly heterosexual, with both parents, husband and wife, children, and even grandchildren organizing gatherings together with other families, and I witnessed this in festivals, churches, and other celebrations. So when you see Filipinos in the in Britain, as against, say, in Israel, it's families, teenagers. It's quite different. It's unbelievably different. You immediately notice this. Even if these families still miss the Philippines and their loved ones left behind, as migrants often do, they appear to have reached a much greater sense of wholeness or completion in being reunited. And I'm going to stop here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pnina.